Okay, hopefully it's going. We're going to get started here exactly at 1 p.m. We have a lot of amazing speakers today, and so we want to make sure that we're giving them the time that is owed to them and their amazing topics, and we're very grateful for them to be being here today. And so we're really excited for this last event. So thank you for bearing with us during all 10 of these webinars. I know it's been kind of a long stretch, but we have had amazing presenters and amazing information at every single one of them. And so we're so lucky to get to close out our conversation with the idea of tribal sovereignty. How does it function both externally and internally? And we have really amazing presenters here to talk about a variety of different topics that relate to tribal sovereignty and the impact that it has both on tribal communities and non-tribal communities. And so we're almost there at 1 p.m. Thank you so much for being here. I know that there were quite a few things happening today, and so I'm appreciative of your attendance to this. We are recording, and we will be making this available right after our presentations are done. We're going to take a few minutes to do some housekeeping, and then we'll have our opening invocation and then go right into our presentations. And so thank you so much for being here with us today. We're really, really excited for all of these great words. And so I think I'm actually going to get started here a little bit early just so we can stay on time and make sure that we have time for everybody. So I'm hoping that what you can see is a PowerPoint, and I'm going to go into my big PowerPoint presentation here. So we'd love to have everyone who isn't a panelist turn your videos off so that we can save bandwidth and make sure that presentations are going smoothly. And we are always, we would love to have you mute yourself if you are able. And we will be patrolling that mute list, that list of participants to make sure that we're muting people so that we have good sound quality. I wanted to say thank you to Aaron Warden again for letting you guys in from the lobby. That takes a lot of concentration, and it helps me perform these a little bit more smoothly. So thank you so much, Aaron, for being here. Again, we are recording this webinar, and so it will be made available afterwards. We do have a chat box that's open, and you are welcome to throw your questions or any kind of conversation that you'd like to have in that chat box at any time. And we will be saving questions. We'll have clarifying questions for each of our speakers right after their presentations, but we'll save those more discussion-oriented questions for the end. And so we'll have some more information on how to participate with that discussion when we get there. And I always just want to mention for those who are on the phone, *6 is the mute and unmute option for if you're calling in. And so we might mute your phone if we hear it making noise during the presentation, but *6*6 will unmute you if you want to discuss with us. And so again, we're going to have an opportunity at the end of this to have conversations with one another. I like to remind people we are open for kind and constructive conversations, and we'll get ready. We'll introduce that a little bit more when we get there. So I do think that we are at 1 p.m. exactly, and so I am going to give the floor over to Judge Bill Johnson. Thank you so much for being here with us. I would love to have you open up this conversation with some great words for us.
Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to start with some, I think, spiritual words, which is a way of our people here, and I think it's a way across the nation, including Yurok. So I'm just going to start with some spiritual words that we want to start with for this meeting. And I'll do it in our language. Kachayo Haniawat, Tatsalach, In Imuma, Kalatewa, In Wanikwas, It's Ayaya, Kash, Wakit Watwas, Haniawash. I guess I'll translate it now into Sheapo Timki, which is English. And just say I'm thanking the Creator for the fine day that we have, and our family and friends and people that are speaking on this seminar, and that we are here today to talk, I think, good words from our heart, and that we will, we're trying to create something that the Creator has made for us and protect that, and live according to Tamanwit, which is the laws of the way that we should live in the right way that we live in the world. These are values that we've lived with through many centuries. And with that, I'll say Nanu Kaush, which is English for so be it or amen. So thank you, Colleen.
Thank you, Judge. That was perfect. So without further ado, to again make sure that we're having time for all of our amazing presenters, I just want to one more time remind us where we are in this process. And so we have come so far in our 10-part adaptation series. We started discussing with water, the first and last of the first foods, and then we moved on and spent quite a bit of time talking about the first foods themselves and the way that we access them. We got to talk about built environments and the way that these impact us and the way climate change is likely to impact these structures that we depend on. Human health and happiness, the way that climate impacts are likely to threaten tribal communities physically and emotionally. And energy use is always something that gets talked about a lot with climate adaptation. And so we were excited to have that conversation. Last week, we had a conversation about economics and community, about the monetary and social way that we interact with one another and the way that climate is likely to increase complications for those relationships in the future. And today we get to have a really important conversation to close us out with tribal sovereignty and the exercise of treaty rights and the way that climate is likely to impact these in the future going forward, both internally and externally. And we have an amazing set of speakers today. We're going to start off talking about the way that tribal sovereignty shapes the region around it, not just for tribal communities, but for non-tribal communities as well. And we have Matt Johnson, who's going to talk with us about those relationships. We are so lucky to have Judge Abbey from the Yurok and the Hoopa Tribal Court talk with us about their push to transition to a restorative justice model. And I'm excited to welcome Judge Johnson back to kick off that conversation and be part of that as well. So thank you again. We are really honored to have the language program. Katrina Miller and Fred Hill are here to talk with us about language and the importance of restoring tribal words, Indigenous words, and culture and language back into the way that we educate tribal communities. And we're going to close out our conversation with Naomi Stacy, who is the director of the Office of Legal Counsel for CTUIR, who's going to give us an overview of some of those legal mechanisms that tribes have to exercise their sovereignty. And so you see that we have this amazing group of people. And so I am going to give it over to Matt, if he is on the line. All right, Matt, you want to take it away?
Thank you, Colleen. Yes, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Matt Johnson, and I'm currently serving as the Deputy Executive Director for the tribe on an interim basis. My permanent position is Communications Director, but I've been in this interim role for about 6 months now. I'm really glad to be here, and thank you, Colleen, for inviting me, and thank you all for being on the line. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about, let me do my share screen here before I get too far. Can you see that?
Yes, we can see it in work mode.
Right, let's see. I'm just going to talk a little bit about my perspective on the sovereignty of the Umatilla tribe and how that influences our resource management capabilities and relationships with other organizations and governments, whether they be federal, state, local, intertribal, private corporations, non-governmental entities, and how we can use those relationships, hopefully, to influence the region in a positive way. So, the foundation that I'm sure has been talked about a lot for these webinars, and I've had a chance to watch a few of them and observe quite a bit of the presentations, but the Treaty of 1855, and I've included here a couple pictures, one of young Chief Joseph and on the right with his family, and then Lawyer on the left. So these are um, some relatives in the past of mine. Our family is descended from Lawyer and from Joseph's sister, so we have some of the Joseph band heritage in our blood. And one thing, I like to mention when I'm presenting to outside organizations or largely non-Indian audiences is how skilled of negotiators our ancestors were, and how much forethought they had to be able to put us in the position that we're in today, or set the framework for us to be in this position today. And they might be changing now, but in the past, there was kind of a perception or a stereotype that Indians didn't understand the negotiations and what was going on. And in my mind, I think of like the Manhattan being sold for a string of beads or something like that. And I really tried to dispel that any chance I get. And our people, I believe, from what I've read and what I understand, had a really good sense of the stakes of the negotiations, and knew what they were doing in those negotiations, even though there were obviously language barriers as well as some amount of duress involved in those negotiations. But one way that I think this is exemplified is in the treaty minutes, or the history of the Treaty Council at Walla Walla. The initial proposal from the United States negotiators, Isaac I. Stevens and Joel Palmer, was for basically all the mid-Columbia Plateau tribes and bands to be moved on to two reservations, either the Yakima Reservation or the Nez Perce Reservation. There was no proposal for the Umatilla Reservation in the first offer from the United States at that Treaty Council. So that was something that our ancestors were able to make happen. They basically said, if we don't get a home land base for us apart from those two reservations, then we won't settle. We won't agree to the treaty, and we'll likely just go to war. So there was a faction. There were people that were willing to fight to the death, and just fight until the end to protect their lands and protect their right to be here. So I think that's a pretty strong example of how good of negotiators they were, to be able to force the creation of the Umatilla Reservation, which today you can see some of the stats there. I think people are pretty familiar with those for the most part, who are likely to be on the line right now. But we did cede over 6.4 million acres and have a reservation today that's approximately 172,000 acres. So yeah, and another thing that's very important to emphasize, and it's I'm sure been a theme running through the webinars, is that the tribes have inherent sovereignty. It's not something that was granted to the Indian people and the tribe by the United States. The treaty recognized the Umatilla Indian Reservation as our homeland and secured that for us, but the sovereignty, our right to use and access the resources that we always had, was something that was inherent in the people, and applies not just on the reservation or even in the ceded territory, but throughout all traditional use areas. And one other thing, possibly Naomi will get into it more. I don't know if it's so critical now for the purposes of this, but there are some canons of construction that apply to treaty interpretation, and all of those canons have been validated at the Supreme Court level, and all favor resolving disputes or ambiguities in treaty language in favor of tribes. So here's the map of the traditional use area. Obviously, that's beyond the ceded territory of the reservation, going well throughout the western United States and along the West Coast. And this is some of the markers that are described in the Treaty of 1855 in Article 1 to identify the lands that were being ceded by the Umatilla, Cayuse, and Walla Walla people. And I think it's interesting just to think about how these were described and by people with imperfect knowledge on behalf of the United States who, you know, were not as nearly familiar with the area as the Indian people were, but these are some of the boundaries that made it into the treaty itself. There's a lack of clarity in some of those terms, and again, I would leave it to Naomi or other of our attorneys to go more into that detail if it were necessary, and probably isn't for the purposes of today, but you know, the descriptions were not perfect, but they did result in this cession of land, which I should also note this was for purposes of the Indian Court of Claims in the 1950s that these boundaries were drawn and those treaty markers were interpreted. So that was strictly for certain purposes and not, you know, there's still likely some room for conversation about where the actual boundaries of these lines should be, but this is the best line we have currently. I also just like to show some of the original treaty pages for those who might not have seen them, and I just never get tired of looking at historic photos or documents, and so I just wanted to share some of these pages. This is the first page of the treaty itself, and then this is the signature page with the names of the tribal signees, and then on the right there's sort of a stamp by Isaac Stevens notarizing those. So again, the treaty being the foundation for the relationship between the United States and the Umatilla tribe, Confederated tribes. You know, that relationship brought with it not only the creation of the reservation and the traditional use rights that go with it. It also resulted in the creation of the trust responsibility, and that's something that arose through the Supreme Court again, and their efforts to try and understand, you know, what are these entities within the United States? What are these Indian tribes? How do we describe them? And you know, at one point there was a term used, the domestic dependent nations, and it has been sort of a paternalistic viewpoint at times, where the federal government knows best, and the tribes, you know, should follow suit with what the United States thinks is best. And at least since the 1970s, I suppose, with the creation of the Indian Self-Determination Act and some efforts to enable tribes to manage their own affairs, the trust responsibility has changed somewhat. Now it's largely looked at as a duty to consult with Indian tribes about issues or topics that affect Indian rights, interests, or resources. I would even go a step farther, and some tribes and their attorneys have gone farther and said that it's not just a duty to consult with tribes about certain issues, but there's actually an affirmative duty to protect tribal rights and interests, at least when that can be described or taken clearly enough from federal law or statute to determine what the duty is. So showed a couple pictures here, which actually go back farther than the treaty. This is from, you know, on the right, there's some examples of the Jefferson peace medals that Lewis and Clark carried with them. And then on the left is a picture here from our public affairs office, where we have a replica of that medal in the office. So just wanted to share that as sort of a demonstration that our relationship with the United States actually goes back even farther than the Treaty of 1855, goes all the way back to Lewis and Clark, although the real formal relationship began with the treaty. So we have that trust relationship with the United States. We have, you know, so many federal agencies that we work with, from you know, numerous agencies within the Department of Interior, including Bureau of Indian Affairs, There's relationships with the Forest Service, Indian Health Service, Department of Energy. There's all kinds of federal agencies with which we do business and do what we can to make sure we have a strong influence or voice on issues that affect our resources or lands. Shifting from the federal level into the state level, we also have a government-to-government relationship with the state of Oregon as well as the state of Washington. These relationships, are obviously a little different. They're not the states individually. We're not parties to the treaty. It's in the United States. That's a constitutional level agreement. Treaties are the supreme law of the land and the Constitution. So states do have a role, though. Obviously, we're within the state of Oregon here, and some of our ceded territories within the state of Washington. So there are issues within both states that have a lot of impact potentially on our rights and resource interests. So we do meet quarterly with the state of Oregon on a government-to-government basis, and are able to talk about any current issues that we might have, from gaming to education to healthcare, criminal justice, whatever it may be. Whatever we need to talk about, we can use that as a forum on a quarterly basis. There's also the Legislative Commission on Indian Services through the Oregon legislature, and that is a group that provides a forum for discussion of a range of issues. A lot of those same things I mentioned are issues and topics that are discussed within the Legislative Commission on Indian Services, LCIS. We also have relationships with county and local municipalities. So we have a number of MOUs, in fact, in the Tri-Cities area with City of Kennewick, City of Richland, I believe, Port of Kennewick. We have just a whole series of MOUs throughout Oregon and Washington that enable us to have a more formalized relationship with some of those smaller subunits of the state government, and give us some structure to work through potential issues with those kind of government entities. Switching to the intertribal level, we also, we participate in a number of intertribal organizations that also have an effect and an ability to protect some of our rights and enhance them where they can. So the Columbia River Intertribal Fish Commission is the first one that comes to mind, and I had the privilege of working there for about 5 years while I was in law school, or before I was in law school, and during, and saw some of the great work that they're able to do representing the Yakima Nation, the Warm Springs and Nez Perce, and the Umatilla tribes. So really important work that they're doing on an intertribal level. HNRTC, that stands for the Hanford Natural Resource Trustee Council. It is an organization or an entity that is made up of not just tribes, but also the state of Oregon and the state of Washington, as well as the Department of Energy, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and NOAA Fisheries. And that group is undertaking an assessment of the injury to natural resources that has occurred due to the release of contamination from the Hanford Nuclear Reservation. So I believe we had Althea Hustes Wolf present on that, as well as Mason Murphy might have touched on that. So something that some of you I know are familiar with, and I'm sure have heard of. So that's one forum we have. Also, I should mention the tribes involved with that are the Yakima Nation, Umatilla, and Nez Perce. For the Portland Harbor Natural Resource Trustee Council, that's a similar sort of entity that was formed under authority of the Comprehensive Environmental Response Compensation and Liability Act, sometimes known as Superfund. It's looking at contamination from releases that occurred in the lower Willamette River, primarily in the early half of the 20th century through World War II. There was a lot of boat building activities, and there's still a lot of industrial operation in the area, though the release of contamination is not as expensive as it used to be. So For the Portland Harbor Natural Resource Trustee Council, along with Umatilla, there are 4 other tribes involved, and that includes Warm Springs, Nez Perce, Siletz, and Grand Ronde. We're also involved in a number of intertribal forums at Willamette Falls, Warm Springs again, Yakima Nation, Siletz, Grand Ronde all participate, and there's a strong interest that a lot of our fishermen have, fisherwomen and men have in taking eels or lamprey from that area. So that's the last harvestable area to get lamprey throughout the Columbia Basin. Although we are undertaking some restoration efforts, I know, in the Umatilla and other sub-basins. ATNI, that's affiliated tribes of Northwest Indians, and they handle a lot of different issues. InterTribal Buffalo Council, National Congress of American Indians, obviously a national level organization that has, I believe, hundreds of tribes engaged in it. So these are just a sampling of some of the things we're involved with on an intertribal level. I should also mention none of these lists that I'm showing or providing are exclusive. There's, these are just a sampling of some of the things that I'm more familiar with, and there's definitely a lot more to our activities than just what I'm showing. So one thing that I've heard Carl Sheeler say, and I want to point out now, but just from our intertribal resource management, we have management authority all the way from buffalo to sea lions. So think about the expansive nature of our co-management and resource management authorities, and it covers quite a geographic and biological range. So here's a sampling of some of our relationships that we have with non-governmental or corporate entities. There's obviously a railroad running right through the reservation with the right of way for that, and so we have a formal relationship with Union Pacific Railroad, and some of you might have seen in the latest edition of the CUJ that Union Pacific actually awarded Yellowhawk $25,000 this last week, I believe, for Yellowhawk's efforts to deal with the COVID-19 pandemic. So getting some good recognition there, and I can't say for sure, but I would think that we for Umatilla probably have one of the stronger relationships with Union Pacific or with railroads that exist among Indian tribes. We also have a relationship with Amazon, and they just recently were able to get our Umatilla dictionary online, so that's available now, and hopefully people are aware of that and can access that as they'd like to. Energy Trust of Oregon, I know there was a presentation through the CAP webinars from some of their representatives, and talking about some of the work they can do to help encourage and promote sustainable alternative sources of energy. Also, on the academic side, there's a number of colleges that we have relationships with, and I also saw the presentation from Sidell Harrison at Oregon State. I know she's she's a tribal member and has a relationship with the tribe. So even if there's not formalized relationships in all these cases, there's personal relationships and connections and programs that have served to benefit tribal members, and also have increased diversity and inclusivity on the academic side as well. We do have a formal relationship with Whitman College. We have an MOU with them. We actually have employees at the Walla Walla Community College. We have our lab there, and Alexa Main is one of the staff there doing some really great cutting edge research on lamprey and mussels. We also have a student at Blue Mountain Community College who is currently serving as the student body president for Blue Mountain. That's Megan Van Pelt, and she's also an intern for the CUJ. So just a lot of great relationships, a lot of places we can build and hopefully continue to collaborate. Washington State University has actually offered to provide assistance if needed with our distribution of COVID-19, of the Pfizer vaccine for COVID. So we haven't had to take them up on it yet, but that is something that we could do. And Washington State University Tri-Cities is just right there in our backyard in our ceded territory. So this is just showing again, not a complete list, but just some of the logos for tribal businesses and entities that we have, and ways that we're able to influence the region. Obviously, Wild Horse is a huge economic driver in Umatilla County, and one of the biggest, if not the biggest, employer in the region. So, or at least in Umatilla County. Again, Yellowhawk is being recognized all over the place for their response to COVID-19 and their ability to adapt and transition to doing the testing and vaccine administration that they've been doing for over 6 months now. Coyote Business Park is doing a great job attracting interest and working to increase the amount of economic diversity on the reservation. So trying to bring people and bring businesses onto the reservation. And it's just I like their logo a lot because it gives that sense of where we are at within the larger Northwest, and kind of being that equidistant point between Portland and Spokane and Boise. It's it's a really good location from that perspective. We also, again, have the CUJ, which is able to transmit information and stories about the tribe. Really, with the internet, that could be anywhere in the world. But we also provide print copies that go quite a ways away, and to tribal members throughout the United States that want those, or anyone else. Cayuse Holdings. Now, this is an outdated logo, but Cayuse Holdings is a number of companies and is really diversifying and bringing in or adding a lot more business for the tribe throughout the United States and the world. And they're doing all kinds of things for the federal government and the military, and providing a lot of data management and support services. And Temustalik is really an incredible museum with really, I think, a unique perspective on from its ability to present the tribal viewpoint, and from a firsthand, or us telling our own story, to again being a unique spot in the Oregon Trail, and really, if I'm not mistaken, the only tribally operated museum on the Oregon Trail. So yeah, this is showing a lot of private industry that the tribe is encouraging and facilitating. Also, some of our internal things like healthcare and media. But we can use all of these things, I think, to not just increase our influence, but to also make people aware of what it is that we're capable of and what we've been able to accomplish already to this point. So yeah, this is the end of my presentation, and yeah, just to kind of summarize, I mean, to me, it's pretty clear, and I went through that all pretty quick and at a very high level, but it's pretty obvious that there's been a number of ways that the tribe has influenced the region. Obviously, we had sole occupancy and proprietorship at one point, so we were the influence on the region. And thinking back to the presentation of those Andrew Adesi or someone with one of the forest or wildlife programs, showing some of the pictures. Oh, Lindsay Chiano, I believe, as well, showing pictures of early shots of the forest from like the 1930s and just the way those were managed. So, it's clear we had, as Indian people, a strong influence on the land, predating contact with European people and society. We have chances to influence education at the state level. We're obviously setting a really good example through COVID-19 again, and our ability to protect the community and provide a very cautious, safe approach while also being able to keep our economy running. You know, through science, mentioned the water and environmental lab. I didn't mention our lab at the domes and the analytical toxics work that we're able to do there, and hopefully apply at Hanford and other places. You know, art, sports, entertainment, you name it. I think we've got a chance to continue to have a really huge influence throughout the region. And anybody watched the Top Chef episode last night, that was another good example of that, I think, and just how broad of an impact we can have. So there's a lot of opportunities awaiting us in the future. You know, with opportunities, there's always challenges and things you have to overcome. But I think if we continue on the path we're on, and the work that's going on through this project is, you know, a really big part of that. Climate change really running through and under everything that we're talking about, and it's going to have an effect on every aspect of our lives. So you know, we'll have to see what those opportunities and challenges actually look like. But I think we've gotten a pretty good sense of that, or at least as good as we can through this series of webinars. And the main thing is that we'll want to continue to have our resources in place so that we can access them and use them and exercise that management or co-management authority. So I will just leave it at that and say thank you again all for your attention, and for anyone who might watch in the future online, thank you as well. And there's my contact information, and would welcome any correspondence that anyone would like to have on anything related to this or anything else. So thank you very much for your time.
Thank you so much, Matt. That was awesome. I know that when I moved to this area, I was absolutely blown away by all the amazing things that this tribe has been doing for itself, but then also, again, for the kind of region at large. And so I'm really thankful to you for sharing these opportunities with us. And one of the things that we do talk about in the climate change world is that the federal government's inability to act on climate change could be considered a violation of trust obligation. And so this is a really important mechanism for us to know about. So thank you so much for all of that. We are going to switch gears here a little bit. So part of our healing from the climate crisis, or addressing the climate crisis, is the idea of addressing harmful frameworks wherever they might exist, or are less than helpful frameworks. And so I'm really excited to welcome our next panelists. Judge Bill Johnson is going to introduce Judge Abbey Abenanti. And so, Judge, I see that you are on camera, you're unmuted, and so please take it away.
Hello, Judge Abbey. Glad to have you here. I'm going to ask you if you can hear me okay, and I tried to warn you that I'm going to maybe speak some Yurok. Can you stand that? I hope you can stand it. So listen, and you don't have to say it right now, but see if I'm saying the right thing, okay? You can be my elder. Wakluki Makinas. Wakluki Makinas. Don't tell me now, but I want to ask you at the end of my introduction whether I said something or not, and I hope it wasn't bad. I've been a judge for about 40 years, and I've known Judge Abbey Abenanti for just about as long or longer, because we were law students together. I didn't go to UNM, I went there for a summer school, and she was there then. I've been a presiding judge of the Umatilla tribes for 40 years, and I think I've known her longer, although she was probably just a 9-year-old or a 10-year-old then. We both had dark hair. I think I was 6'4" then, and she had really dark black hair. And as I remember her, that she also had a kind of a temper, because it matched mine. So I do remember that. I've been a presiding judge in this. I've been an Indian, a practicing Indian all my life, practicing Umatilla all my life. I was mentored by my elders, my family, my uncles, and mentored by as a judge, as a young judge by all of them, as well as a guy named Raymond Popcorn Burke, who was a judge, chief judge, our only other chief judge besides me. And he taught me how things should be and that people were very important. He also said there are things that we want to keep doing and do ourselves, that we wanted to do our own justice system, and we wanted to do it our way. And I think that the people have always said that to me, and I remember that all the time. My elders also say to listen and to do the right thing. And we, I think, have done that. We don't write our Tamanwit, our customs and traditions, which are our traditions and our language. We don't usually write that. Indians didn't write things down, but we call that, and my elders always told me, that's our common law. That's how we practice things. It may not be written, but it's something that we will continue to use. And so those things are instilled in our laws. And they've been given truth, value, and recognition in all that we do. I think not just our behavior, but how we write our laws. So I know that Judge Abbey, I call her Abbey, but I think she likes to be called Judge Abbey, so I'll call her that she was born on the Yurok reservation, that she was raised by, I think, a very kind, gentle grandmother who had a cane, or maybe it was an auntie, had a cane that sometimes had to correct her and caught her very, very, very often if she needed to be corrected. She grew up on the Yurok reservation, which is in Northern California, if any of you don't know that. She's the important thing that she's done besides her life and what she's doing now is that she was the first Yurok native indigenous person or woman admitted to the California State Bar, which is very, very impressive because that's a giant bar association in California and a very tough test. She has served as a Yurok tribal judge, I think, since 1997 or before, possibly. And I think she's been chief judge since 2007. You can correct me if I'm wrong here, Abbey. And when we met first at UNM, it was for the LTIP program, the American Indian Lawyer Training Program. It was in the summer that I was going there. And that's when I saw, I think she might have been president of the Indian Law Association or Indian Law Students Association. That's when I saw that she could have a temper. She's a very important person in the judiciary and in Indian country across the nation, and she's very well thought of by not just me, but a lot of people. And with that, I'll introduce Judge Abbey, but I want to see if she passed, or if I passed the test of Wakluki McInnes. What did I say?
Thank you.
Hey, was it McInnes, the thank you part, or which part is?
The first part.
Okay, so what I thought I was being said because I was looking it up on one of your documentaries. It said Wakluki McInnes, and it said, thank you for coming.
Yes.
I thank you for being here, and I know you're going to say a lot of important words, so I'll be quiet. Kala.
Neck now, Judge Abbey, Rekoy Ak, Ayukui, and thank you, Bill, for your kind introduction. I want to talk a little bit about food sovereignty and the whole issue of what we need to do around that. And we're lawyers, we understand what sovereignty means, but I think what we need to do is take a step back and say, what does that mean to us as tribal people? And I think that what we have to realize that sovereignty isn't about, as the English translation makes it sound like it is about, power and who has the power to. For us, it's about responsibility and who has the responsibility to do certain tasks. We were given gifts when we came here. When you look around you in your homeland, you can see, wow, we really got a lot here. There's so many things that are interlocking. You know, for us, we have the river, we have the woods, we have the acorns, we have the animals, we have so much, we have eels. And we have a beautiful place that when the invaders came, actually sheltered us because we could run and hide. And that's why probably to this day, we're the largest surviving tribe in this state, because we had that and we were protected. And now we have to look around us and go, you know, what we did then was necessary. But now if we don't come out and protect those people and those beings that are here, that were put here, that we have a relationship with, they're not going to make it. And if they don't make it, we're not going to make it. And actually, even though they may not understand that, the invaders won't make it either. You know, because if you destroy a place, you can't stay there because there's no way to be maintained in that place. And so you have to understand that as you move forward, and as you move forward in the world, you have to go, okay, how are we going to do this? What are we going to do? And as you're planning your life as a human, you have to look at, okay, food is a big part of that. You look at, for us, it's fish, it's acorns, it's gardens, it's whatever, and go, how is that going to happen? How are we going to put food back into its main position here? Not to you know, I spend my share of time in Safeway and Walmart also, but there is a better way to do it, in a way that's more helpful to us. And as we look at how our eating habits have changed, they changed because we weren't given access to our gathering and hunting ways. When we were forced to live on reservations, they took a lot of that away from us. But in so doing that, it has an impact on us. And that impact was, for the most part, not positive. And this, again, I'm talking about food and food gathering. And so we have to look back to those values and go, okay, why did we have those values and what did they do? And should we just evolve and continue to get in line at Walmart? Or was there a reason we were given those values? To me, I think there was a reason we were given those values. Because when we ate like that, when we cooperated in community to gather and to provide food to the village, we had much more harmony, and we had less poverty, we had less illness, and we were able to move forward in a more positive way. Now that's a value. And I certainly understand a couple of 100 years have passed. How are we going to recreate that? What you're looking to do, what I want you to look at and what I want you to think about is, okay, this is our value system. Here's the invasion. Here's today. How are we going to develop practices that are consistent with those values for today's world in this climate change mess that we've all created here? And part of how we're going to do that is we're going to look at where we can do, for instance, gardening. You know, can we have gardens that we share among families? Can we create gardens at schools so that we teach our children about gardening, so that they know that part of their activity at schools is going to be around gardening, is going to be around, you do this, then this food will come into your cafeteria. And some of this food will go home. Part of it you will give to your grandmother, part of it you will have at home. All right? Those are the lessons that we need to do. And we need to take that step backward and say, this is what we're going to do. And to me, that's what food sovereignty is about. It's about responsibility to prepare food, appropriate food, our food, to gather our food, and to make sure that we understand what our responsibilities are. People say to me sometimes, well, do you fish? And I said, well, you know, at my age, that's why you have nephews. You know, do I go out in the boat? Sometimes, yes, I do, because I enjoy that. But I don't do that, you know, and there is a responsibility that humans have. And that's the responsibility. And you have to set up this internal mechanism again and recreate the value system. The fact that we have children in this country and elders who do not have enough to eat is on us. Those of us who are out here doing that. That is not okay. And we each bear some responsibility for that in what we do, what we teach our children, what we teach our grandchildren. And we have to work on that again, and we have to develop practices. You know, one of the things that we do in our court system is work on, like we have an elders program. We make meals in the court and deliver them because I believe that is a legal responsibility. I believe that's what sovereignty is about, is protecting those things. So you'll see a lot in our court that we do, and other people will go, well, wait a second, is that a court thing? Yes, it is. Because that's what sovereignty is about. It's about responsibility, and it's about interlocking responsibilities. And you must be responsible, and you must be responsible to provide as you are supposed to. You know, and we're looking at starting gardens at 2 of the elementary schools. We're looking at, okay, just individually, how are we going to raise money to, let's see. All right, there's somebody that's saying there's some issues about frozen something.
Sorry, I didn't
Yeah.
want to interrupt. I just had one person email me saying that their visual was frozen. And I just wanted to see if others were having that issue, and I didn't want to interrupt your amazing flow of words. Please, I think that you're okay.
Okay. Well, freezing me is perfectly fine. Now I don't know where I'm actually, I've disappeared from my own screen, which I frankly don't mind, but it works for me. Oh, there I am back again. It's just me and Bill. Whoops, gone again. Anyway, let me get back to what we're supposed to be talking about, not my screen. I think that we want to look at these issues and seriously understand and not recreate the boundaries that other legal systems have created, because we're not about power and rights. We're about responsibilities and interlocking responsibilities. And once we forget that, we go down the wrong road. And we don't want to do that. I mean, you look around you, you look at what the invaders have brought, you look at their legal system, and frankly, we survived here and did really well for thousands of years. In a couple of 100 years, they have messed the entire joint up. You know, and so what you do not want to do is copy what they have done. And so when you're looking at your structure, look at the structure of responsibilities that you had in the villages that we all maintain, and make sure that we step up and that we do that. You know, having the right to do this or the right to do that, having some kind of power thing, that's not what it's about for us. We have all these other responsibilities, and responsibilities to not take too much. You know, it was never about take everything. It was never about get there first and make sure you get the best. It was never, ever like that. And we can't become those kind of people, or we will lead to more trouble for all of us. And the other part of this is that these people who came here have created a friggin' mess. And in truth, they need us to step up and to demonstrate how it should be. Because if we don't even give them a model or an option, they're going to continue to do the only thing they know how to do. And we're the ones that have the models. We're the ones that know what the options look like. And if we don't develop them and let them see them and share in them, what in the world is going to happen to all of us? It's not going to be pretty. You know, we have to face our ancestors someday, and we have to face our grandkids. And what are we going to say? What in the world are we going to say? And I think that's what we need to look at. And I think I went a couple of minutes over my time, but I'm going to blame that on, I don't know what. Maybe I'll blame it on Bill. That seems, I've always done that. It's always worked for me. Thank you.
Thank you. No, I could listen to you talk all day, quite frankly. So the few minutes is perfectly fine. I know that you are probably not able to stay with us for the rest of this time. So I'd encourage anyone that has any kind of specific questions to ask them now while we have you. And I really appreciate your words on this, because for me, food is really the thing that ties all of this together. And so I really appreciated that you even spoke to that and the role of justice in reviving pre-colonial practices. Are there any words of wisdom that you could leave for those of us who are trying to decolonize in our lives wherever possible, especially in the context of environmental degradation?
I think that what you have to do, what all of us have to do, is realize it is in your memory. It is in your DNA. You know what to do. Go out and do it. You know, this is not something you don't know. You may have forgotten it for the moment, but you know it. You know, and that's why when you say, oh, yeah, that makes sense, it makes sense because I'm talking to something inside of you that's there. You know, part of what happened when we lost, in some ways, many of us, the language was in English, it's nouns. In our language, it's verbs, it's actions, it's doing this, doing that. And they don't have the words for that. But when I tell you words that help you link it up, then it's like, oh yeah, I remember that. I'm not telling you anything that you don't know.
That's so powerful. Thank you so much. We're so grateful to have you here with us. I think that actually sets us up really nicely for our next conversation about language and the way that the words that we use impact us. So thank you so much, Judge Abbey. I really, really appreciate you being here with us today.
Okay, thank you. Thank
Yeah.
you all. All right. Shoot.
Thank you. Kitsiyaya. And so with that, I am going to see if our amazing CTUIR language program is on the line. Fred and Katrina, can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, perfect. So I know that you guys have a PowerPoint that you had sent over to me. Do you want me to pull that up here for you?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Let me get that up and running. Do you want to introduce yourself while I am getting that up?
Oh, okay. Enosh Vanisha Yatili Lawit. My name is Katrina Miller, and I'm from the Yakima Nation, and I'm the program manager for the language program. And I've been in this position for about a year. And I'd like to thank Colleen for inviting us to share on the webinar today. And what I would like to do is, we're doing a lot of things to get the language out to the community and to the people. And, this can't be done, by one person, it's done by the team here at the language program. So I would like to introduce our staff. You can click to the next one. So here, Modesta is our education director, and myself, Fred Hill, he's a master speaker. Antone, he's a Cayuse Nez master speaker historian. Thomas, a Umatilla master speaker and historian. And we have Mildred Quimps, master speaker. Damian Totis, language instructor. Gretchen Kern, tribal linguist. Lisa Minthorn, Sahaptin technology specialist. Kristen Parr, the Sahaptin language archival specialist. And Jonathan Geary, Sahaptin language resource developer. Aaliyah, Sahaptin language apprentice. And Claire as the Sahaptin language apprentice. So this is our team here for the language program, and I'm really honored to work with such a good team and with the language to get it out there for the people, to preserve. And we want to have more people learn the language, of Walla Walla, Nez Perce, and Umatilla. So, but anyway, I will hand this off to Fred for the rest of the slides, but thank you very much.
Hey, Nick, Patway, Jake Wasla, Yatili Lawit, Kushki, Colleen, and Kunam Chinam Wikush Chanachi, this webinar. So good to see all of you. Well, your names at least, and your still pictures. But in the Shwanisha Tautelich Tanan Timki. My Indian name is Fred Tautelich. My English name is Fred Hill. I was born here, Pendleton, Oregon, raised out Mackay Creek, went to school at Pilot Rock, raised by my grandmother. Tquinanmai was her Indian name. Her English name was Annie Jo. And also had an uncle. Her son, he was my mother's brother. He raised me too. But just honored to be here, to be considered to be make a small presentation here about the language program. And so, as you'll see in the slides that we had Jonathan Geary work with us, and I feel privileged that we have a language program, that we've had a language program over the years. Early on in my younger years, I think I worked with Ron Pond, who is Dr. Ron Pond today, as well as Isaac Patrick and different ones on just simple language translations for numbers and colors and animals. And that was through like a JOM project back in that time, and not thinking that our language program would eventually evolve and become what it is today. And so we've made a lot of huge strides. And I've only been employed with the language program for going on 2 years. But other than that, I've had the opportunity to work under the Pendleton School District, the Nishawa Community School, and share much language as I could with our high school students, as well as with recreation program during the summer months, and any and everybody who is willing to learn our language. Not only is it Umatilla, we have Nespers, as well as Walla Walla, Palus, Shwanwapam, Wayampam, Yakima dialects. So we all have a very similar related languages, just like how a lot of us are related through families and blood. And that's how I believe that our language is too. So you'll be able to read all the information through the PowerPoint presentation. So I'll just go ahead and see what the next slide is there. So you'll see our mission statement and everything. So if you'll go ahead and go to the next slide, and the alphabet that we've adopted over the years. And it was a privilege to meet Noel Rood when I first came around. Dr. Noel Rood, at that time when we used to have many elders that were involved with the language program and the early documentation. And it was always great to be amongst them with their stories and humor, as well as their real in-depth knowledge. And so with a lot of the, words, names that were documented, stories, and even, the appreciation goes beyond even Dr. Rood, back to Bruce Rigsby, Dr. Bruce Rigsby. And I believe he's still alive and resides in Australia, from what I know. And also Dr. Philip Cash, one of our own tribal members, that's a linguist. And so as we've adopted this alphabet, years ago, my uncle, Charlie Mackay, he was very instrumental in helping me learn to read the language with the English alphabet. And so he would write me letters in Chamawa, and then he would have some Indian language in there, and then I would have to interpret what he would ask or say. So I would send him a letter back, and not expecting anything, but maybe to see if I got him right. But here he'd he'd send a little incentive, $20 or whatever in the mail, and tell me, that I was doing good. So he kept me active and involved and encouraged with the language. And so, with the way that technology has evolved over time, we've got the Sahaptin keyboard, and so we're able to use all of our symbols and everything and letters that we need. I think we only have four basic vowels that we use, and so and it's a great thing that we have. So if you learn how to read the language, and then you'll be able to pronounce some of our language words. And so same time as I'm learning to read our language and language words, I'm also learning how to read Nespers, because part of my bloodline is Nespers from my paternal side. And it's a great thing today that just very, very recent that our Umatilla Dictionary has not only been published in the hard copy form, but also online. So that's a great thing today. And so I teach the Umatilla Nikyawi to the Nikyawi students, as well as Damien Totus, and then our apprentices along with us. And we also have community classes and a Blue Mountain community class. So let's go ahead and move on to the next slide, if you would, please. And so again, this community class is for, I think Damien's going to start his on Thursdays or Wednesdays or something, but there'll be little changes there. But mine has been going on on Thursdays at 11. But same time, adjusted my schedule, working with the language program to keep our young people involved for their language credit for the Nikyawi Community School. And at one time, I believe it was dubbed, when we first started the program, that it was dubbed as a foreign language. And so that got changed into that, as a second language. So I'm glad that we have that to be able to teach our languages, not only in the high school and the community. And my sister Mildred has also worked with the Pelk school and teaching a lot of those Indian kids language, native and non-native. And also a lot of kudos out to Linda Sampson for teaching our kids, our food songs. And I was just watching a clip of that not too long ago when we had a feast, our children's feast at the Longhouse, and all those kids were saying the songs. They're singing all the words in the song word for word, and kind of almost like got me beat, because some of them are songs I don't quite know. And it's a lifelong endeavor to continue to learn, our religious songs that have the language in them, what we call Tam Sinwi. And also, so we're Jonathan, Gary, and myself and Kristen Parr, we're very active in keeping our language in the CUJ. And so I'm glad that, so hopefully it's, we'll get foot to the front of the page or front rather than clear in the back. So when you see the language, read it, check it out. There's a lot that goes into it that we want you all to learn, specific words and pronunciations, and email us or ask us questions. We're just dying for questions. So again, so like I said, and also this year, this winter term, we had the Blue Mountain Community College Umatilla 101. And so that's been via Zoom. And that's been a great opportunity. And with the efforts of Gretchen Kern and Jonathan Gurias, and then also Annie Smith, having worked with the Blue Mountain Community College staff to get this class up and running. And it's great so far. And we're teaching our people how to speak Indian, Umatilla. Okay, and then again, as you see down there, that the Umatilla Dictionary is online now. Now you'll know. Now mi sinuit na Imatalam. imitalam sinuit na. So no excuses. So everybody should be able to open up their phones, their laptops, or their their notebooks, what have you, and be able to kind of start deciphering and learning, your language. Okay, let's go to the next slide if you please. Or is that it? Is there any more slides? Okay. And our role in teaching first foods and cultural knowledge. Ako namit kwadet diwat out ni. Our foods are sacred. As a young boy, our family, our grandmother, she taught us, about root digging. And I was just reminiscing about a woman that I think they had their funeral today in Yakima, that her family would come here and they would come up here to go dig house, stay with us for a week. And so just thinking of the Tamascan family today. And but our foods, it's a very, it's been an integral part, our life ways all throughout, especially having known that back in the early times, before my time even, that you had heard of what they called the Depression years. And a lot of our Indian people were able to sustain their own lives because they had stored food. And that was always the life cycle and seasonal cycles of our Indian people, was storing food, the salmon, drying deer meat, drying the roots. And a lot of this was way before they had learned how to can foods. And, we've heard stories, that everything was in those ways, our kunch, the pine lichen and those type of foods. So very important to know, the ones that are the right ones to dig and which ones are the ones not to dig. And it's all by what they call the hahan, the flower tops. So, some appreciate all the efforts of everybody in the community that has shown our kids. And we got to go out and share with Jonathan Geary, and as well as Gretchen Kern, her husband. We brought them up to go dig, and they dug their first roots ever. And so it was a real nice day. So that was one day we just took to do that. And so I was gifted with Gretchen's husband's roots to myself, and then the others will share with the other families that will need them. So again, so our staple root that we've always been known for here is haush. And so I'm not sure what we got written in there, but like this is how we have the cultural lessons. And so I always, like I say, I always appreciate what Jonathan. And so when we put in any of the language in Umatilla, we also want to have the equivalent of how it's mentioned in Nespers. So Kristen Parr, as well as myself, we work together to make sure that we include both languages. Okay, so what is our next slide? So as we aim to incorporate language in sharing cultural practices and teachings, so again, this Tumaicht, I think it was a couple of summers ago that we did the Tumaicht project, and I believe you may have seen that actual production. And I can't remember the name of the father and son team that came and did that production for us, but it was quite. I think it was in 2-part segments when they did prior to the one we did at Indian Lake, and it was a great opportunity to learn how our elder people had cooked years ago, and how not only would they cook the roots and the pine lichen, the conch, but I used to hear stories from my uncle how that would be how they used, if anybody shot a bear, that they would bake it underground like that. And So that's something, and I believe at the Nishawa Education Center there, in to the left of the main entrance, is a termite area that we still have yet to use. So anybody that wants to be involved in that, like to maybe put that effort together to have a termite of kunch or whatever that we want to cook underground. And so again, as we put this piece out there of the statement of saying, Mani pawata mianashma, Mani pawata mianashma, how will the children be? We've heard this from our elders. They was worried about us. What if we would uphold the language? What if we would uphold the songs, any of the culture? Because even in our younger times, that there was a lot of things that would cause us to be distracted, but yet the culture is what keeps us focused and on that right path of who we are as Indian people. And so as we get older, we realize like the Indian foods are a real lifeline of our lives, because it's talked about in our songs, and it's all presented in front of us. When the waikanish, the salmon nusuk, is set out, awina, and the deer meat, chnit, all the roots that are dug, tamanit, wiudnu, go tmish, and chush. So it's it all evolves around that those nami yayako patma, big brothers and our big sisters. Okay, so I can't read that bottom piece there, what it says, but go ahead and let's go on down to the next slide if you have one there. Oh, okay, so Nche Kwasla, and this is how we say thank you. And again, just very grateful. Again, Inishunisha Tautalix. My original Indian name was Kautalix, from my paternal side. And if any of you have Indian names, let us know your Indian names so we can, if it's not documented, we'd like to document them names, for the records of, for the sake of your children and grandchildren. And again, we just, everything's, for our children, Namimianashmiyai, for them. And so I'll go ahead and open it up for if anybody has any questions or comments.
Thank you, Fred. Yeah, if you guys have questions, go ahead and throw them in the chat, or you're welcome to kind of raise your hands and ask now. I know that I haven't been able to make it to your language classes lately, but I really, really appreciate the sharing of the language that your program has done. I was attending Mildred's classes when they were in the afternoons a couple years ago, and even just training my mouth to make the words and make the sounds was definitely a learning experience, but it has been so rewarding. And I would encourage anyone, it's an amazing way to get to know the tribe and get to know the culture, and hear some amazing stories that you wouldn't get to hear otherwise. So I'm opening it up. Does anyone have any questions that they would like to ask?
This is Katrina again.
Perfect.
Oh, can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead.
Okay. I just also wanted to share that the language program works with the Oregon Department of Education for the biliteracy test, where students get tested right now we're doing NSPERS and Umatilla. So if they pass the test, they get a seal on their diploma. And we also work with SB 13, Senate Bill 13, to implement lesson plans for the 9 tribes here in Oregon. So I just wanted to share that with everybody too. Thank you.
Thank you. It looks like we have some rather shy participants here today, so we're gonna move along. Thank you so much, Fred. And I know that I'm hoping that you'll stick around and give us some words of closing at the end of this. And so we're so thankful for your knowledge and your willingness to be here, and for Gretchen and Jonathan and Claire and everybody who put effort into making this come together. Thank you so much. We have our last conversation about legal protections and legal frameworks that we might be able to use to expand tribal sovereignty, especially in the context of a changing climate and changing environmental degradation needs. And so I'm hoping that our Director of Office of Legal Counsel, Naomi Stacy, can you hear me? And you might be muted, so that might be, you might need to unmute yourself. I can see that you're here. All right, let's see. So Naomi, we're not able to hear you. I'm wondering if maybe there's a technical issue that I need to work out. Oh yeah, and Jonathan reminded us that the language class is available and open for people to attend. And so he's put that link into the chat. And so thank you so much for doing that. Naomi, oh, I see your video, perfect.
Hello, and thank you. Just a moment, I'll go ahead and get my materials up.
Thanks for being here. I know that this has been a busy week for everyone, and that the digital age is definitely throw some extra challenges in the way. Thank you for being here.
Oh, sure. I was trying to find my actual link because I had gone too many pages away. So here we go. Okay, how's that view?
I don't see anything. I don't think that you're sharing anything at the moment.
Okay, I'm glad we practiced yesterday.
Me too. This has been the biggest challenge, is like learning the share functions, because it's kind of picky. So it definitely is not an intuitive thing.
Okay.
And if you want, if you email those over to me, I can also pull up the PowerPoint or the document that you have.
Let's see. So I think I might have it.
Oh, there it goes. Perfect.
Oh, very good. Okay, well, thank you. It's a real pleasure to join and speak with you today, and hopefully it'll lead to some good conversations. I really feel fortunate to be in the lineup. A little bit about myself. I am Naomi Stacy. I'm the tribe's lead attorney for the Office of Legal Counsel. We do the tribe's legal representation in both litigation, but also in giving advice, drafting, and a whole smattering of other issues. But mostly today I've been invited to speak about cases that apply to climate change and what that might mean for tribal sovereignty. And so we'll have a short overview of those cases today, and we'll just walk through. I only have 6 slides, but they're kind of packed. So here we go. Let's see. So today we're going to talk about 3 main areas. First, we'll talk about tribes and federal Indian law. We'll talk about cases, as I alluded to, and then we'll wrap up with some specific discussion points about tribal sovereignty and considerations when the organization is thinking about how to protect its interest, how to combat climate change, and how to make sure that our resources are here, not just for now, but for the future. So there's two main areas that when we talk about federal Indian law, to make sure that there's some fundamental concepts that we talk about with folks. And so you've probably heard in the lineup with previous speakers, hopefully everybody's mentioning the tribes treaties. But when it comes to relating to courts, I'm going to talk about first about that relationship, and then also how federal Indian law is interpreted and what those relationships start to look like. So some of the key concepts on treaties and courts is that the United States relationship, as I hint here in item number 2, is that it's primarily a federal relationship. The treaty making period with the United States and tribes was one of the earliest formal stages of the United States. And it started off with a long federal relationship that exists to this day. That relationship started off with generally making treaties, but then it was followed by a whole nother series of federal policies towards tribes. And the whole idea about making treaties was primarily to secure basically the right for the United States to take land, use land, dispose of land on behalf of the United States. And at the time that treaties were being made, the United States was expanding. So that treaty making period was then followed by removal of Indian people from the traditional areas. Some tribes were moved many miles across what we now would consider several states, halfway across the continent. And some tribes were able to remain in their Aboriginal or traditional homelands like Umatilla. But that period was, so we talked a little bit about removal. There were also then periods, federal periods, where the federal policy was then to assimilate Indians as if they were going to go away and become something or someone else. It was followed then by a period of recognition that those federal policies had largely failed, and that perhaps tribes really do better when they are organized under their own governance. And so that period was called reorganization, and the federal policy was to encourage tribes to develop something more formally recognized as governments. But then that was quickly followed by what was called the termination period, where the United States realized that what it considered its Indian problem was not going to be going away, that there was going to be long-term commitments and impacts to the United States and their obligations. And so the United States moved forward to terminate its federal relationship with many tribes across the United States. And also for those tribes that they weren't terminating, they also sought to go ahead and impose either state criminal or civil law over reservations in an effort to bring what they considered more order and provide access to courts for disputes on reservations, was what was said. And then in the 1970s, shortly after maybe the civil rights era movement, that we moved again on the federal government side, recognizing that tribal governance and tribal self-governance was really the answer and the way to go, that tribes, their recognition of not just their treaty rights, but their right to govern themselves, make their own laws, were most important and foremost. And there was a large amount of legislation that was implemented at that time and has been since then. Most of these periods that I talk about are hearkened with different junctures of a lot of legislation, and we'll talk just briefly about that concept. But all of that relationship was really about federal policy towards Indians. And we'll talk a little bit about what those impacts are to the Treaty of Umatilla, Cayuse, and Umatilla tribes and bands and Indians, or excuse me, of Indians in Washington and Oregon territories. Oops, wrong date there. But what I would note is that it's important to also remind, because I've found in our work to remind folks that our tribes were spread out across what is now considered Oregon and Washington. I know they were often considered an Oregon tribe, but it's important to remind folks that the United States entered into this relationship recognizing the span and breadth in which our tribes occupied. How does that relate to then the practice of federal Indian law? I'm not going to go into super details here, but you will recognize some of these themes. Even if you've not heard the terms, you will recognize probably some of these relationships that you've seen the courts and decisions have to the interest of not just the Umatilla tribes, but many other tribes as well. So the relationship about what happens with treaty making period and all those periods I talked about that the federal government's federal Indian policy are often interpreted through the Supreme Courts. The important part to understand about the Supreme Courts is that their precedences usually are applied to across Indian country. So although it may be one tribe appearing before the Supreme Court, typically those decisions often will be applied to basically all the other cases that come behind it that might be reasonably related to those issues. And the idea being that the court is not there to litigate every instance of a dispute involving any party, including tribes, but that they will set the precedent and that will apply to similar types of cases that come behind that. We also know that we've experienced for Indian country is that we've had a long relationship where there might be federal legislation out there, but the Supreme Courts have taken either active steps to impose more than what legislation has said and really come out with decisions that are considered judicial activism where they've gone above and beyond what legislation says. And then finally, we try not to get too lost in the details. If you're not a practitioner, that's okay. Don't feel bad about that. It's incredibly complex. It requires just consistent analysis of the tribe's history. And a lot of times these cases will end up harkening back and walking through the whole period that I talked about of federal policies, the federal relationships, how the treaty was negotiated, and all that's hundreds of years ago. It's very important and very relevant today for almost every tribe that goes back before the courts. Some of the important other elements to think about is that when, whoops, we got too far ahead here. When the courts have had to make their interpretations about the rights of tribes and also how does that fit within the federal visions of themselves under the United States Constitution and the separation of powers. Some of those determinations were made very early in the development of the United States. And so the Supreme Court, as it was marshaling, or as it was not just marshaling up its own position, had an early Supreme Court justice in the 1830s that while the United States was figuring out its powers between the president and Congress and the court, the judiciary, the Chief Justice Marshall, there was authored some very important decisions about some just primary considerations for matters that come before the Supreme Court. And so at that time, they were busy reinforcing that federal primacy over a number of issues under the Constitution. And what we found under the Marshall Trilogy is a series of cases. So Chief Justice Marshall, in those cases, the outcomes of these disputes about states trying to outlaw tribal laws or trying to reach in and regulate matters within reservations or disputing who could buy land from tribes or have ownership interest over lands that tribes had either ceded or sold. That's the Marshall Trilogy, and here's the outcomes. First, it was establishment under law under the Supreme Court that these are federal and tribal relationships, not tribal and state, not tribal and private relationships, but federal and tribal relationships. The court also recognized that tribes have what they call the aboriginal right of occupancy. So tribes have a right to occupy their land until they're either conquered or agree somehow, theoretically voluntarily, to vacate their land. And then that tribes, although they are sovereign, they are not the same sovereigns as being a foreign nation, which is one of the claims was, well, the Cherokee Nation in one of the cases said that, well, we are not under the state laws, but we're not a foreign nation. And what the court decided was that tribes are dependent nations. They still retain attributes of sovereignty to the degree that it is not in conflict with the roles and powers under the United States Constitution. And under the Constitution, it does have an article that names a relationship in a couple different places with tribes. But that also established that there was a federal, again, reinforced that federal tribal relationship, and that the federal government was also responsible for protecting the sovereignty of the tribe in a way that they considered it a ward to a pupil. So not really very complimentary terms, pretty derogatory, but that did establish what we could call the modern day trust relationship between tribes and the federal government. And then finally, some other influences on cases before the courts is that if there's to be an interpretation of a tribal treaty and of statutes that might affect tribes and their treaty rights, is that you should and have to under the court is interpret treaties as Indians would have understood them. Those treaties should be liberally construed in favor of the Indians. And if there are ambiguities, they should be resolved in favor of the Indians. So you would think that these are some very powerful tools, and sometimes they are, and then sometimes, depending on the composition of our Supreme Court, we've had various outcomes over the years and in cases involving tribes and their rights. So let's get to that. Let's see how we fared. So we're going to talk about these cases today. So there's 5 of them. Some of them are tribal and tribal treaty specific. I put a few that involve the Umatilla tribes as a party. And then finally, this last one here, this Juliana versus the United States, is the claim of youth about climate change and the role of the federal government allowing climate change in a way that will harm and does harm those youth rights to really a climate that is not going to harm them. So we're going to start first with U.S. versus Washington. It's a very old case. It has hundreds and hundreds of sub-proceedings to it, but the general gist of U.S. v. Washington is that first, there was a recognition that tribes and tribal treaty rights, particularly in the Northwest, that tribes have retained for themselves the right to take fish in usual and accustomed fishing locations and areas. And that was hard fought by the state of Washington. There's a parallel case, U.S. v. Oregon, and those were the early parts of the litigation. The next steps were then to consider which areas did tribes hold that right. And so in Washington, they've spent many, many a year under many proceedings, they call them sub-proceedings, where a tribe would then file for recognition of their area where they could fish. And so that part has been just a big bulk of what U.S. v. Washington has undertaken. But starting about 20 years ago, there was another stage to U.S. v. Washington. And that claim was by those tribes with their recognized treaty rights that Washington was maintaining culverts that were blocking fish passage, because fish runs over the years, particularly the last 40 to 50 years, have really taken a nosedive. Some of the species are right on the edge of even being viable anymore. And the tribes were really looking for ways to enhance their treaty habitat. And despite all the work that you can do on restoration, there are some things that you cannot overcome, and fish passage is one of those. The tribes banded together and notified the state and said, we have identified these culverts. You are blocking our passage, and they're blocking our treaty right to access those fish. And it's making it so that you're impacting our treaty right. The state had a number of responses, but basically worked on just a couple culverts, and then thought maybe they might be able to move forward without getting much more work done. And the tribes continued to hold them accountable, had meetings voluntarily, because U.S. v. Washington requires that you notify the party, particularly the state, if you have a dispute against them. Basically have an opportunity to notify that party of the problem, and then see if you can't remedy for an outcome before you proceed with the full set of litigation. The tribes maintained that process. They exhausted that process, and really with the state of Washington not wanting to step up. In particular, they were concerned about the extent of what that would mean for their obligations on the state side. And it meant replacing culverts across the state, which is really spendy for them. The tribes went ahead and filed then before the federal district court in Washington. They were successful. They filed again on appeal, and the state of Washington appealed that. And then the Supreme Court, when it got its case, basically really upheld the tribe's treaty right to have meaningful access to taking fish, and recognized that Washington had had every opportunity to remedy these culvert issues, and that tribes, their treaty right is not just one to, dip your net into an empty river. It is meant to be meaningful and persist over time. Washington argued that they had every right, every right to go ahead and harm fish, even if there was no fish left to be harmed. And the court really just railed against that, which was a great outcome for us. This is, I think, a 2018 decision. And the United States also backed the tribes in those claims. So we thought that it was a pretty successful outcome. Some of the arguments that Washington also posed were that if the implications of the culverts case were that if you can force this state to go ahead and have to replace their culverts, what would that mean for something like the Columbia River dams? And so the court noted that that certainly was something that was out there, but that was not the claim of this particular dispute. And if you're aware of, and there's another time and place we can discuss the implications of US v. Oregon, but that is exactly the current dispute, long-running dispute about not just the operations of the dam, but the viability of them, and if fish passage is possible and adequate, and what those mitigation measures require. So we've got an important case out there that protects a tribe treaty right to take fish, and that conditions cannot come along and impermissibly intrude upon that right to take fish. In Yakima versus United States Fish and Wildlife Service, this other case here, this is a different approach where the right was, well, I'm going to back up before I talk about what the right was. In Yakima versus U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, Yakima is the lead plaintiff, but it also included Umatilla and Nez Perce. And the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service manages an area adjacent to the Hanford site up in Washington State. And in that area that U.S. Fish and Wildlife manages in a cooperation agreement with USDOE, the entity that operates Hanford, is that there was also an effort from that agency to cooperate with the mandates of legislation under the National Reauthorization Defense Act. And under that act, there was to be wildflower tours to occur at Rattlesnake Mountain. Rattlesnake Mountain is a traditional cultural property. It's very important to the tribes, both culturally, for plants, and also for religious purposes. And so the tribes had urged U.S. Fish and Wildlife to be protective of Rattlesnake Mountain, to make sure that there was plans and consultation so that there could be mitigation against any damage or impacts to the interests of the tribes. And U.S. Fish and Wildlife basically gave short shrift and held a number of what we would consider inadequate consultation processes. And the important concern here is that consultation is meant and required to be meaningful and adequate to make an informed decision. And when U.S. Fish and Wildlife went with closed ears, part of their duty is to make sure that they have enough information to give to the tribes so that you can see what the impact is on your plans. And then for the tribes to be able to make an informed then set of information and response back about those impacts and how to meaningfully protect the tribe's interests and rights. The court found that U.S. Fish and Wildlife failed to do so. The tribes had told them so and exhausted those voluntary opportunities of communication with U.S. Fish and Wildlife. And so that was really important because it shows that consultation, even though it doesn't often have a remedy listed in the consultation requirements, that there is a way to, one, stop that kind of impact, and two, that there's accountability. So those tours have ceased, and now this tribe is actively requesting U.S. Fish and Wildlife to re-engage in consultation. We list the third case as neighbors against bison slaughter. It's in the U.S. District of Columbia. This is another case against U.S. Fish and Wildlife. And so these are generally property owners who live near or own property near Yellowstone National Park. And there is a place called Beatty Gulch where when bison leave the national park, that's where hunters have been taking bison that are available for hunting, both tribes and non-tribes. But what the Neighbors Against Bison Slaughter claimed was that there is a federal law called the National Environmental Act, this little acronym here that we placed on the screen it's called NEPA for short. And what NEPA is it is not a tool that says you can or can't do these activities. It requires the federal government, before it takes an act, to decide if there's an environmental impact, and if so, what is the scope of those, and then to offer well-informed options that are more than one option, one, and two, that can tell you what the impacts of each option will be so that there can be well-informed decision-making. What the Neighbors Against Bison had claimed was that this NEPA process was failed and inadequate. It did not consider the harm to them by being in the area where bison were taken, and it was also harming their property rights. They filed first in the U.S. District Court of Columbia, but the Court of Columbia declined to give their requested remedy, which was an injunction or like a restraining order against the U.S. Fish and Wildlife and their plans to authorize hunting. Then the matter was referred to the District Court of Montana, the Federal District Court. So Montana again denied that there will be any restraining order issued, and that's a two-step process. One, you go to the court first and you say, I need an emergency restraining order or an injunction to stop this. And so failing at that, then the Neighbors Against Bison then said, we want to have a permanent, we want to proceed to the actual merits of the case. And that way all the parties are present, because when you go for the first one, you can go without all the parties present. And even if it's issued the injunction, then you will have to show up at a later date and then show why your injunction should continue. And you'll have to face full arguments of all the party before the court. So that case was denied for the preliminary, and then on they call it the merits when you're doing the full argument, that was also denied. Neighbors Against Bison Slaughter have now filed before the Ninth Circuit to have that review. But what I should say, when Montana denied the Neighbors Against Bison Slaughter request for an injunction or a restraining order against the government, is that the court found that NEPA analysis, the environmental review, had been adequate. And so that was helpful, and the tribes were a party, or excuse me, an amicus to the matter to make sure that their interests were protected, because tribes have been long working on their bison hunting plans and making sure that our coordination with U.S. Fish and Wildlife was sufficient, and that they would continue to recognize our treaty right to take bison. And then this last case here, which is not the last, but it's the one that last that Umatilla was a party to on this screen, is the Tesoro Savage permit case. So when you look at cases, we're not always in a federal district court. Sometimes we're in a state court, and then sometimes we're before administrative agencies, either of the federal or state nature typically. That's because they're often managing resources that are impacted or will impact our treaty rights, but we aren't always the one in charge of that. And so sometimes we're appearing places that you might not expect. So this was a Tesoro Savage permit to the state of Washington to have a crude oil distribution center. And that is a matter that is permitted, really, the authorizations occur by hearing of the Washington Energy Facility Sightings Entity. We call it FSEC for short. But that is a group of folks who are appointed by the governor of Washington. And what they do is, if there are concerns, then you file for a hearing before FSEC. And FSEC then heard the concerns that were filed before them, because there was not just tribal concerns, but many people who lived in the area and also environmental interests who all filed concerns before FSEC. If permitted, it would have allowed for territorial salvage to transport, I think it's up to 360,000 barrels of crude oil a day to be distributed from that center. And so there were great concerns about whether the environmental analysis impacts, the state version of that, were sufficient, if there was enough emergency response planning, if there was consideration for endangered species and those impacts, if there was consideration about impacts to tribal treaty rights. And so I listed here that the denial of the permit, and I should say the FSEC found that there was a recommendation not to issue the permit. And they make that recommendation to the governor, and then the governor decides whether to issue the permit or not. The governor also took the recommendation of FSEC to deny the permit. It's not the only reason that that permit was denied, but there was certainly a part of the record, and Umatilla argued in front of FSEC that the failure to recognize both the impacted treaty rights and also the lack of emergency response planning was an important concern that we had brought to the table. As those proceedings were occurring, they were already set for hearing before FSEC. That was the same summer that there was then a derailment over by Mosier on the Oregon side from Union Pacific Railroad, and that there was a large fire there. And so that was something that was considered for the tribe's arguments about the failure to have an adequate emergency response as well, using that example from Mosier. So that's some of the tribal cases. This last case, Juliana versus United States. This is in the District Court of Oregon. This is a group of youth who asserted that the government's affirmative actions that cause climate change violate those youngest generation's constitutional rights to life, liberty, and property, and they fail to protect the essential public trust resources. And I'm going to switch screens if I can. We'll see how it goes.
It looks like it's going to go. We got your desktop.
Okay, let's find my case.
It looks like your browser is open, but it's on your other screen, maybe?
Okay, hold on here. So it was up, but it had to go away when I relogged back in, I believe.
Technology.
Apologies, folks. We really did practice for you.
There's always something the day of that makes it interesting.
Yeah, but let's go ahead. I think actually it's fine to go ahead and share the search process if you're interested in the case. And so we have, if you look at, this is what we're going to choose because they've got something really interesting worth further mention here. So here's this website. It's Our Children's Trust, basically the youth versus the government. And so it has good background on the more details because you can tell I'm glossing over a lot of details in this. But to get the gist of the arguments out here, I'm just going to bounce down to those issues that were in the case. So when you see a court case filed, there's always the parties at interest. And so there's usually somebody who's advocating for a certain position and somebody who's responding and sometimes defending an opposing position. And when the courts hear a matter, there are, of course, those direct interests and claims that have to be vetted and then a decision made. But when the court is faced with making a decision, they will also accept briefs from parties that can help illuminate the court on some of the impacts of their decision. What will that mean? How will this apply? And more importantly, help the court consider if their decisions really are what they intend them to be. They have to do that within the bounds of course, reading the law. They can't make new law, but usually these amicus briefs are meant to help show what that impact could be by the court's decision. So forgive me for scrolling through here. This is a really nice website with lots of good information, but what was interesting about the amicus briefs that the court accepted are some other elements. So we were talking about tribal interests in these claims, but outside of the tribal interests, there are also other policy decisions that are important to the court's consideration. And those policy considerations typically come through interpreting, of course, federal policy and the legislation that's out there. But there are also outcomes and policy points that courts have arrived at because they've been hearing these types of cases for quite some time. And so there are other tools out there. And so when I scrolled through these amicus briefs, it was interesting to see the kinds of positions that were advising the court about the potential outcomes. So I'm just going to briefly walk through those because they're helpful. So the party submitting, so there was a number of environmental advocates here, but you can see that there was a discussion about demonstrating that the U.S. international commitments and international law and evolving jurisprudence or law in other countries support the fundamental right to a climate capable of sustaining human life. And if you've had a chance ever to look at the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People, and I think one of the presenters might have done that, at least an allusion to what those issues are, but those are a really great set of translations that we think of, I think, from tribal communities. It's a good translation to like the fundamentals of what your rights should be. So in the United States, I think folks are really familiar and get taught in school the Bill of Rights and what your personal civil rights might look like and should be. But what was really helpful about the United Nations declarations is it's like a translator, so that as an Indigenous people, that it helps talk about often your relationship to where you are from, your commitments and relationship to natural resources, your cultural practices, and helps recognize and then discuss the protection of those. And those are really helpful. So it was really exciting to see that this was then a focus of this amicus party. And then we had other really environmental kind of focuses here. There's objecting to the government's inappropriate bid in the guise of a mandamus petition, which is really wanting to declare a certain action. But there was an objecting to that of really a well-reasoned decision in the lower court. And I guess I should say before we start talking about what court decision there was, there's really been procedural arguments all along about if there's what's called standing. Who had standing? Do you even have a dog in this fight? Do we recognize in the courts, can you be in this court? And that's really what the disputes have been. And so this amicus brief group kind of spans that spectrum. And so the trial, I don't believe is occurring yet. It was extended, the date for trial was extended by COVID, but it's all been procedural up until this point. Standing. So there was folks advising about the standing of those children with the focus on the impacts of climate change on the oceans, how these impacts have harmed youth plaintiffs, and support for what we call the federal public trust doctrine. That's a recognition that there is not just like a federal trustee relationship that tribes have, but there is also a federal trust doctrine for just general citizens to have rights to clean air and water and land and basically places they can be safely. And then you had a slew of faith organizations who argued that the moral foundations of government stewardship and the action on climate from a perspective of multiple faiths support the public trust doctrine. So often we're battling maybe some old era ideas that natural resources are there only to be exploited and only to the exclusionary interest, only for the sole interest of mankind, basically. And it's not everybody's view. And so it's helpful that somebody besides tribes are saying this. And then there are these law professors, a whole number of them, and we've seen a really interesting trend over the last, 15 years or so of law professors really taking interest in briefing the court. And so they really focused on what is substantive due process under the Fifth Amendment. What does that mean for everybody else? So under the Fifth Amendment, that protects your right to property, to liberty, to life, without, and that you have that right and that you retain that right, and the government may not take that from you without due process. And so that idea here is continued to be advanced. Something worth mentioning is that there's a parallel idea under Indian law that treaty rights are protected by the Fifth Amendment. They're considered property rights that are typically under the ownership or control of a tribe. So collectively, the tribe has the right to the treaty right, and that impact on that is really a taking and protected by the Fifth Amendment. And so it's helpful to see that these also are concepts outside of Indian country. Finally, the League of Women Voters and just went ahead and targeted like the role of courts as checks and balances on the political branches, and how irreversible impacts justify urgency and standing for youth. There was another amicus brief that argued about the public trust doctrine and the obligation to protect common property, the property of the people, really. And then a Sierra Club rounded out with limitations of litigation using some statutes and the reality of the Trump administration undoing past progress. So that's the type of impact that the courts will look at when they're making decisions in this case. As I alluded to, this is still in the really the procedural end, but those are some tools that are out there that that tribes can consider in their own sovereignty. And you can tell because I was able to draw some parallels between tribal treaty rights and also what the federal courts have recognized as like public trust doctrine and property rights that cannot be divested without due process. Those are out there as tools to use in climate change. There's not a lot of super direct climate change cases that are out there, but I'm going to talk a little bit about how do you use some of these tools, because there's a lot more, but how do we use some of these tools when we're looking at protecting tribal sovereignty, particularly with the ever-changing impacts around climate change. So on the governance end, I think it's really something that we hearken on quite a bit is to make sure that that the tribal government has clear policy that integrates into tribal social, cultural, traditional, economy, and treaty purposes. And the reason being is that when examined from either the outside or the inside, is that you're looking for governments to have a clear policy and what are they protecting? Why did we make this law? Why are we taking these actions? And it's really important to harken back to what those really are. What I told Colleen when we prepared for this discussion, and if there was anything useful to bring to this from my end, is a conversation where I said, I want people to know that when the tribe continues to be itself, when it occupies all of its area, particularly, culturally and traditionally, economics, and fulfills its treaty purposes and practices in them and nurtures those, that's actually when we are most successful defending and advocating for the tribe and its treaty rights and its interests. So how do you do that? And how do you do that in a way that can be successful? So the structures and frameworks of our tribal government are really powerful to do that. So these policy considerations here, those ones are ones that then need implementation. So make sure that you have frameworks that demonstrate that those functions are occurring, that we have services that reflect and show that they're carrying out these purposes, these policy purposes, and why, and report on them and record their data so that you can give life to that story. And you can show that there's something behind the policy. We aren't just saying it, we're doing it and we're living it and we're adjusting as we move along. And so you want to make sure that you have things like, for example, we have a tribal comprehensive plan that sets up very broad policy goals. It has some benchmarks, whether you like them or not. The fact is that there are benchmarks, like there are performance standards that we think will measure if we're doing what we want to be doing. We have services that are meant to carry these out. I think some, we mentioned, I think in the advertising materials that described what I talk about today, that things like fish consumption rate, that was a really important juncture. It wasn't entirely just tribal. It engaged at the state and federal level. Was that this tribe was a big leader in talking about how do you protect the right to eat clean fish that do not harm you. And so this tribe, through really its natural resources and other departments, developed a recommendation based on really the consumption rates, both at treaty time, but also modern times, and explained the difference between why there might be a change, that there was more fish eaten in the past versus today. And then said that we still have the goal of being able to eat as many fish as we would have. And we want to do that cleanly, we want to do that safely, and we want to be able to do that without harming, further harming our species and their survivability. That fish consumption rate that the tribe set for itself, it incorporated into its own water quality standards, was really powerful in advocating with states when they had to set their fish consumption rate. So that's one of the examples, or translating the way that the First Foods program and the First Foods policy, what those policies do is it helps translate what the leadership policy goals might be, but then also directs those programs about how they're going to operate in services, and then again do the activities it takes. So the field work to monitor the data and to see if it's really achieving the goals that are under there for their purposes. So those are all really important ways that structures and frameworks can give life to tribal sovereignty, but I'm going to talk a little bit also about why those are very important for, again, the advocacy and defense of cases. So this third bullet point here talks about inherent sovereignty. So when the tribe is doing those first 2 points, those are ways that we can point to that the tribe is exercising its sovereignty. It is determining for itself how it will govern, and then it is taking those steps to make the services happen. So exercise your sovereignty, be sovereign. There are a lot of cases out there, and there's legislation out there that is devastating for tribal jurisdiction. But this tribe and many other tribes, we're not alone, have found ways to step past that or to build bridges over those limitations about our jurisdiction over what we call a checkerboard reservation, where not everything is tribal land, not everyone is tribal. And the outside courts have seen that as a reason to harpoon or take shots at tribal sovereignty. But our tribes have found, and we've found our partners out there who've recognized that comprehensive natural resource management in particular is not something you can do on a patch by patch basis, that our policies for clean water or for livable land or clean fish, you don't do that based on, well, Indians live on this parcel and then non-Indians don't, so you can do it here, but you can't do it there. We have our own partners, we have our own policies that say we have to do this comprehensively. And so we've found those ways, and those are really important. And sometimes it means you have to be creative, because sometimes the law does not support us in those relationships, but we have found different ways to do that. Well, what are those ways? And so that harkens to really my last talking point here is non-cases, because the law is not always our friend, or our courts are often not ready for the remedy we need. I think there's a case out of South Dakota where the tribes there were very successful in being able to make a claim that their land, the Badlands, were improperly taken from them, that they're very important culturally, both for its natural resource, but also for their creation and their religious beliefs. And even though they won recognition that those lands were improperly taken, the remedy for them was not to get those lands back that they need. It was money. And that tribe has never used those dollars. Those are sitting and waiting for the tribe to take them, and they won't. They need their lands back. They need their lands back so they can exercise their rights and responsibilities that they're obligated to under their own laws and under their own sovereignty. And so you can't always get the remedy you need in our court, in the United States courts. So what do you do when your case in courts can't be enough for you? Well, you have other tools. So consultation is one that on the government side is used quite a bit. And consultation in itself isn't or sometimes isn't the answer to everything, because we saw that in the U.S. Fish and Wildlife cases that the agency was there, but they weren't intending to consult. They weren't using the full meaning of making an informed decision about your impacts, making sure that the tribes are helping you with that discussion, and then projecting, like, how do we protect against those impacts or mitigate if there are. So consultation also, besides the opportunity to have a better plan, also I call it leave no record undone. So you also want to make sure that you have a clear record that the tribe has claimed and shown you its treaty interest, that you had every opportunity as a federal agency to make an informed decision, and that you made a decision that was informed and accounted for what you knew. There's it's not a tribal standard out there, but under the laws of the United States, many of those agencies are subject to what's called an Administrative Procedures Act. And it sounds very bureaucratic, and it can be, but the tool of that is that those agencies are responsible for not making arbitrary decisions. That doesn't mean that just because you disagree that their decision is arbitrary, but their decision needs to be based on something. And if you as a tribe consulted with an agency and they fail to take into account your good job of creating a record that you have a treaty interest or a statutory right, that you gave the information to the agency and they basically failed to do anything about it, then you can make a claim that that decision was arbitrary. There are also agreements and partnerships, because sometimes consultation can be really fruitful, especially with partners who are ready. So agreements and partnerships will often address some of those impacts. There are also tips that you, whatever role you're in, the goal is to lead with solutions. So often what will happen is that you'll have a partner across the table who is perfectly willing to do something good. But what we've found at Umatilla is that not all solutions are the right solutions. It's important for the tribe to do its best job with its information, with its policy goals, to figure out what they think their solution is. And that's because you've found that we've had outsiders like the federal government fixing things that they think are a problem on reservations and in country for many, many years. And much to the avail of everybody is that they're not always solutions, and sometimes they make things worse or unintended consequences. And so Umatilla and all tribes, I would encourage them to lead with their own solutions with whatever capacities they have. And sometimes the solution is things like capacity building, and other times it is recognizing us as co-managers of a resource, or sometimes sole managers of a resource. So those are important things to know your own solution. Make sure it reflects policy and the structures that you have or the capacities you have. And it's okay that you may have more than you want or less than you want, but the thing is to take ownership of where you are and build that road for them to partner and help you. And then wrapping up with, I think one of the other speakers talked a little bit about that they work on legislation and that sometimes is important to the impacts of the tribes. And so this arena that I'm privileged to work in, I think, is that it's both law and policy. And so we see a lot of not just litigation and tracking cases, but also we see a lot of legislation get to help make recommendations about how legislation should be formed or drafted at of course, the tribal level, but also at the state legislature and the congressional level. And some of those issues to think about is that often we will see an issue where our tribal staff have done great work at the operational level, at the technical level, and they've exhausted what they can do, and there's a barrier. And often what will happen is then our office and or the communications office, who does a lot of the public affairs, which is really a lot of legislative relationships and other government relationships, will then be engaged. And so our folks have done all of the first parts. We've got clear policy, we've got structures, we consulted, and none of that worked. And it's because there's often just much bigger issues that have to be corrected. And sometimes misalignment in the law, misalignment in agencies. And so that's where you'll see us kicked in and working on issues. So when we think about how to help protect the tribe and its issues moving forward in climate change, those are some of the talking points that I'd like to end with.
Thank you so much. I know that we are slightly over time, but I want to make sure that we are here for the purpose that we're here for. I hear the echo, and I apologize for it. So Naomi, I know that there's one hand up, so I wanted to acknowledge that, and I wanted to say that Fred has some closing words and some song for us. So what I think I'd like to do is ask Naomi one question that we had kind of talked about, and I'd welcome everyone to turn their videos on if they'd like. You and I, when we were setting up for this, we talked about, carbon pricing schemes. So we've had a large push recently to look at carbon as a harmful pollutant that it is contributing to the climate crisis. And these come out in frameworks like cap and trade or cap and invest. And carbon taxing. And I know that there's a lot of mixed opinions about the carbon crediting and carbon markets in tribal communities. And so I was wondering if you'd speak a little bit to issues involved with carbon pricing that come up for tribes and this tribe specifically. Oh, you're muted.
There we go. All right, so great question. So what we've seen is two things I think worth mentioning. One is that there was really a development at the early stages of a few models out there that really were focused on what's called cap and trade. And the idea is to set standards of the maximum amount of pollution that you're going to allow. And then you're going to tax the polluters who then get to that point and want to exceed, and you're going to tax those levels of exceeding. And then you're going to create an economic market by then recognizing credits of entities or communities or owners of basically, it's usually timber, quite frankly, that offset all those carbon emissions typically. And so that's what you saw. And immediately, I'm working for another tribe at this point when we start looking at those issues. It's a heavily forested tribe whose economy is largely based on natural resources, including timber. And so the very first thing that they asked was, what does that mean for our timber stands, and who's going to get credit for those? And what if we don't want to participate? And is the state going to take credit for our timber? And those are all great questions, and that's exactly what the issues are. So most tribal communities, I didn't get the numbers, but most tribal communities is where a lot of these timber resources are on or near or have very significant interest in, particularly in the Northwest. And so recognizing tribal interest to timber, making sure that people are not appropriating or basically taking credit for what is not theirs to take credit for, is a tremendously important issue that we watched out for in state legislation. We've seen this in Washington and Oregon. And so there was that issue. The tribe here and any other tribe should be able to make a determination about whether they're interested in joining that regime, that they could opt in if they wanted to. And that might save a tribe from having to create a whole new structure to engage in those things. Or maybe a tribe completely wants to be the one who does that structure. And so one of the issues that we considered for when Oregon was wanting to do this, because they've made a couple runs at it and haven't quite got there yet and have not been successful. But the other issues so wait, we are a community who definitely did not do the most of the polluting. And now what's going to happen is some of those taxes are going to be very specifically focused on transportation. And so now we have already had a case through the courts that we have paid a tax collected on fuel and remitted it back to the state. And we have an agreement where we keep the taxes from tribal patrons, but for non-Indians, we're supposed to pay that according to the courts. And so we have an agreement that recognizes, well, there's some administrative costs involved with that. So maybe we're collecting it, but at least it won't be our burden to bear the cost of administrating that and getting it back to the state for taxes that are collected on non-Indians up at Arrowhead. And so we said here, why would the state keep any more taxes? It's their patrons polluting our lands. We should just go ahead and rescind everything and see how that goes before climate change at the state level is trying to intrude upon those interests. And on top of it, we're also a rural community. So yes, we do travel great distances. We don't have the convenience of having everything very close by. Traveling 1 hour is not really unusual for people in this area, if not hours. But people in the metropolitan area, they can get away with traveling short distances. They have very robust public transportation systems and those kinds of things. And so those are all elements about what tribes will want to consider. It's important to decide on the policy level, like what is most important, why are we doing this, and what do we need to protect? Tribes may choose to end up in a very similar situation, but they may choose just different goals. And so those are arguments that tribes should decide, and that should not be one that's left at the behest of, basically state legislatures. But the tribe engaged, and those are useful. We were able to go ahead and get elements into the legislation that recognize that tribal sovereignty will be engaged over tribal lands and tribal resources. To include tribes with some of those impacts because we're rural, to our jobs, because the idea was what we can't grow now, but you've already grown and messed everything up. And so now we're going to bear the burden for that. No. And so those things are good. That's why you want to build good state tribal relations. That's why you want to engage with your state on the legislative level. Because, sometimes in the past we've said if the state missteps, we'll just sue them. But sometimes you can do better than just suing.
That's great. Thank you. I know that there's one hand up, so I would like to invite attendee name Old Whale Sukh Samson Cruz. If you want to unmute yourself and speak, or if you want to throw a comment in the chat. Now
Good day, this is Kathy Sampson Cruzy. My Indian Walupam name is Old Whale Sucks. I have 3 fast points since you're over on the webinar. And I've addressed these at our general council meeting and also sent multiple emails to the Board of Trustees. And the first one, Naomi, is, are we on record against the perennial wind chaser frack gas facility that is like a zombie facility? If you look in the most recent East Oregonian, they have some new crazy investor that wants to open this place, which will be a huge polluter in our UNA. The second area that I'm concerned about is the SMNRs. And I saw most recently that there's a partnership that is now formally happening for Hanford. And I've talked with the board and specifically with Jill Marie Gavin, who is on the Hanford advisory with Armand, because the SMNRs is just another nightmare waiting to happen, like Hanford, that our children will be stuck with forever and ever and ever. So hopefully we have somebody on our lawyer team opposing that and getting their head wrapped around it. And the third one is still Hanford, and it's that darn old Columbia generating station, that is sitting right on the riverbanks and needs to be decommissioned. That's all. Thank you so much for all your hard work, everybody.
Okay, great questions. I'm going to try to do them short in the response. As far as the frack gas, I'm not sure. I am unaware of the tribe's position on that. What I would do is ask if we've done technical comments, because often those will occur really on a notice to the tribe. And the tribe will often have a department send out at least technical comments, usually seeking at least more information and inviting a full consultation. I've not seen that it had, basically exhausted that process and became an issue where usually it pulls in the attorneys. So that's my short answer, probably not very satisfactory at the moment. And then for Hanford, there's, the 2 things that I'm I'm going to briefly touch upon is that the SMNRs are part of the active cleanup here and now. And so most of that gets handled through one of the other programs. If there is basically not a problem, but if they run into an obstacle where they cannot achieve something that we should be able to achieve, then we'll hear about it. It's not been elevated to this level yet. And then finally, the Hanford generator. So that will be part of the long-term natural resource damage assessment, which is in progress. It's supposed to be concluded by 2024. I have no hopes that USDOE is going to make that deadline. And we are taking them to task on some other issues related to that at this moment.
So I just have one follow-up note. SMNRs are small modular nuclear reactors that were developed down in Corvallis by NuScale. And these things are being deployed up at the facility site in Idaho, up in Canada. Bill Gates and Bezos is involved. My brother helped us get a resolution passed at AT&I to try to stop some of this, greenwashing that's happening. So I know I'm on the board for the Columbia Riverkeeper, and I know they meet with you folks regularly. So I can ask, Lauren or Miles to send some updated information that we have. Thank you.
That'd be great. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. So unless we have anybody that wants to say any final words, any of our panelists are welcome to. Fred, I know that you're still on the line, and I want you to close us out. So short final thoughts from panelists or general council chairs. Okay, perfect. Fred, I would love to invite you to take us home to close out this webinar series with some words and some song, if you don't mind.
Jikosla, thank you. Again, for this final webinar, it's been very informative to all of us. And we will continue to have a lot of questions seeking answers to, what our inquiries are. And so as we conclude this webinar, with the song, so we'll just give everything to our Creator. Nami ani aslanna, anakapan ni rasyakwasha. Anatun iwan nami tamnapa, anatun iwan nami pwitpa. And of course, nama nawachiao cook, na natlawi ashata nami tamnakni, awashapni nami aniatlana, and the kuinak noitsta nami mianashmaman, and the kukushki nami wialch imaman, and the shiman poa payui, Umish Tamainachi, Umish Chow Awan, Neat Man. So again, with these few words, I'll go ahead and conclude with the song with the bell. Thank you.
Thank you. That was a perfect way for us to end. And so thank you all for everyone who came to attend this and who have been attending the webinars, and for our amazing panelists and this wonderful community that has so much knowledge within it. I am excited for the future, because the future that we build will be a bright one. So thank you so much for being part of this webinar series. And I look forward to presenting the climate plan to you here the first week in June. We'll be doing another round of listening sessions the first or second week of June, and then we'll close comments on the plan for on June 21st. Friday, June 21st will be the closing of comments on the plan, and then we'll have something final out to you by July. So I look forward to having this all out and done for you, so that we can continue to move forward. Thank you, everyone, and I hope you have a great weekend.
Great job, Colleen.